Good evening, everyone. Going to give you a few seconds here, see who all is going to pop up. Hope everybody's having a good day. Good evening, everyone. I know just started here. I'll give a few seconds to allow people to join us. I'm a little bit of a novice at this, first time doing one of these live from my home and from my camera, and I'm going to try to pay attention to comments so I can certainly answer any questions you may have along the way as well, and appreciate all the folks that are joining with us here today. Hope you all are doing well. It's a beautiful day here in Virginia. I've been outside catching up on some yard work and things like that most of the day today, sort of getting my mind right for tonight as we talk about images in my collection and talk a little history. Hope that you all have been able to venture out in the midst of everything going on these days. Hope you've been enjoying everything where you're at. Appreciate everyone who has joined us so far, and I will probably kind of get started here as we have others join us or maybe even watch this video later. Welcome to Caretakers, to the next installment of Caretakers, hosted by the Civil War Photo Collectors Society and our Facebook page, Civil War Faces. Special thank you to Doug York and Ron Coddington, who have made all of this possible with these caretaker programs. Some of you may actually remember we sort of did a trial run at Caretakers back last August, and we did it with myself and Doug York here at my home, and we had Ron come in remotely, and so we knew then it was something that I think people were interested in. They were interested in coming and seeing collections and talking about history and talking about the things that motivated people. And so it's an honor to sort of be back now that we've kind of kicked off in full swing, maybe by necessity, with the virus bringing everybody at home and a captive audience. I know many of us are missing the Civil War shows and other events that would bring us all together to talk about images. So it's quite a blessing that we've got the Photo Collector Society and Civil War Faces to be able to do this program, especially on a weekly basis, see some things we haven't seen online or on social media or in one of the magazines or books, as well as give an opportunity on sort of a live basis for people to ask questions, comment on things, and learn some history, which I think is what we're all passionate about today. I'll also add, guess what? You know, it's the first Saturday in May. All of us on any other occasion would probably be out at our local Kentucky Derby party, or maybe you're at the Derby itself. So the next best thing that I could do this evening, got my straw hat, decided not to wear my seersucker, but I did go ahead and pour myself some Kentucky bourbon tonight. Got my mint julep cup here. You see that's glistening from that frost, and got a nice mint julep. Hope if you are enjoying at home, cheers to all of you for joining us. And with that in mind, we will kind of get started and kick things off. As I mentioned, I helped host the original Caretakers program that we did back in August. And so then in that program, for those of you who saw it, or maybe you didn't see it, I talked then a lot about my passion for collecting and my passion for history, and specifically collecting North Carolina images. But we didn't go into a lot of detail at that point about some of my images and about the project that I had been working on with some others to tell the story of North Carolina's Confederate soldiers. So I was going to give an opportunity for that tonight, talk to you about that, answer any questions that those of you who may have out there. When we talk about North Carolina Confederate images, there's no part of that story that can begin unless we talk and start with the book that Greg Mast authored back in 1995, State Troops and Volunteers. And it's no longer being published. It's available on the secondary market. I know those of you who are familiar with the book, it is quite expensive. But it is the seminal, in my opinion, it is probably the seminal book on North Carolina Confederates, and maybe even the seminal book or the benchmark for image books in general. Greg's book was certainly a work of passion. He spent, I believe, 5 or 6 years specifically on that project to get it published, and the end result was 600 images of North Carolinians who had served, and Greg walked out of that project realizing not only do we probably have enough material for a volume 2 with an equal amount of images, but also probably a volume 3. And the support for it was just that tremendous. And interestingly enough, or maybe not interesting, maybe not too surprising, the majority of these images came from families. They didn't come from dealers. They didn't come from collectors. They came from individual families who wanted to be a part of the project. And unfortunately, for a lot of reasons, which I won't go into tonight, the state of North Carolina did not kind of finish the effort and put forth the support for that volume 2 to ever come into fruition. Interestingly enough, the material is there. The images are there. In fact, I know there's enough images probably to do those multiple volumes of stories, just like that original book is. And it was with that in mind that discussion started happening between Greg and myself on where do we go from here. If the state of North Carolina is not going to publish a book like this, what is the next choice? Can we publish a book? If so, what is that going to look like? Obviously, if you're going, what was done in 1995, while it's one of the best out there, if not the best, we would do it differently today. We would probably hope to have color images, high resolution scans, not just in, a print that a family member sent into the project. And when you talk about doing that type of thing, when you talk about doing that color book of 600 soldiers, you're looking at a very high price point. And so then the next discussion was, well, do you do something different? Do you do a website? Do you do social media? Kind of the interest of people is ever changing. And so that's one of those things I'd love to hear from comments from people like you all on, do you like the book idea? Do you like Facebook? We have continued with posting images of North Carolina soldiers through social media. You'll see posts from me, primarily from my own collection on Civil War Faces, but we also have the State Troops and Volunteers Facebook page. I'll kind of give you a little plug for that, and we're working on transferring those images to a website. It's sort of a work in progress, but that can be found at tarheelfaces.com. More than anything else, though, our plan and what I have continued to work with Greg Mast on these last 2 years is document and get permission to use images from families, images from collectors, dealers, people like you all out in the world who have images. Get those images out there, talk about those images, talk about the history. And I welcome any of you who do have North Carolina images to share those with me if you're willing, we certainly would appreciate it because it helps tell the story of those folks. You can submit images, you can submit stories with it. We welcome your own submissions if you've written up a history of a particular soldier that you have. Likewise, if you haven't done that or that's not your forte, we're happy many occasions where people will send us images and say, hey, we know that this is, John Smith from the, 10th North Carolina, but we don't know much else. Either Greg or myself will research those, dig a little deeper, pull census records, pull military service records, and write up a history to go along with it, much like you see each of the histories that are in the original State Troops and Volunteers book. So that's kind of the big picture of the project. I call it the Tar Heel Faces Project, call it State Troops and Volunteers, sort of following in that system, but obviously knowing now that we're not going to get the help from the state of North Carolina, we're kind of doing it ourselves. And for, at least for me, for somebody who's got a full-time job, that's a little daunting, just kind of doing it in my spare time. Interestingly enough, over the years, really in the past 30 years of Greg doing this, when you count the number up, we have, and this doesn't necessarily mean we have permission to publish, but we have over 2,500 images of North Carolina soldiers, and that just gives you an idea of how many there are out there, and I'm sure there are many more. I mean, we see on a weekly basis images that I've never seen before, Greg's never seen before, that are still in families or have been tucked away for years and years, and just waiting for that story to be told. And so that's kind of a gist of the project in and of itself. As I mentioned, feel free to comment about that. I'd love to hear people's thoughts on kind of what the next steps are in making the project go to the next level. Likewise, shoot me a message if you want to talk some more about specific images that you all may have. And with that in mind, I'm going to shift over to talking about my images. I pulled a few out of my collection. Told Doug and Ron I would, kind of give a little history of those. One of the things that I wanted to do, I know it's hard for, or at least for me, when I've watched some of these other programs, it's kind of difficult depending on lighting and images themselves to be able to see them. So this week, in my spare time, quarantining, if you will, I took each of the images that I was going to feature tonight and did an enlargement of those so that I could kind of hold that up and talk to you a little bit about that image, and hopefully you could see some of the detail that I'm going to talk about. The first one we're going to start out with, probably one of my favorites. Probably going to say that a lot tonight. I guess it probably goes without saying that I wouldn't have obtained it or purchased it if I didn't really like it. And that's probably the same reason I keep probably 98% of my images, is that I don't want to sell. I buy them for a reason, because I'm passionate about their history. And so bear with me as I tell you that each of these are my favorite. This first one, this is William Penn Metz. I'm going to try to hold this up here so everybody can at least see it for a few moments. This is a half plate ambrotype of Metz, and I'll hold this for a few more seconds. This was taken by the photographer Jesse Cowling, who was a photographer in New Bern, North Carolina from the mid-1850s to about midway in the war. He actually, I believe he died of yellow fever or some other illness during the war. Lieutenant Metz, we know that this image was probably taken in 1859 or 1860. He was a lieutenant in a pre-war militia company known as the New Bern Light Infantry. This is their uniform. And when the war breaks out, Metz is actually superintendent of trains for the North Carolina and Atlantic Railroad system. And so while his passion is for the South and for secession, he's not one of these early joiners. Instead, he continues to operate the railroad, the local train, because at that point, the train system was very important for the state of North Carolina. However, he does remain with another militia unit, and that unit was known as the Athens Guards. And so he sort of did, weekend service with the militia, kept the train running during that time, and does this until the spring of 1862, when the Battle of New Bern occurs, and ultimately, as you all are probably familiar, New Bern falls. And so he's now essentially without a job, but a good skill, and that is he knows how to run trains. And so he spends the rest of the war from 1862 through 1865 operating trains both within the state of North Carolina for the various railroads, as well as for the Confederate government in the transport of supplies, troops. You know, sky's the limit there. One of the interesting things I found, I mean, you can tell this is a young man in this picture. Folks who were working with the train service, with the railroad service, actually fall under that exemption with the Confederate draft. So that's why he himself wasn't required to join up in the service, but rather could continue on, in this case, probably a much needed service operating the train. He continues to do this after the war, operates and works on the North Carolina and Atlantic Railroad basically to retirement into the 1880s, and lives to a good ripe age. Dies in 1897, and he is buried in the city of New Bern today. I'll also mention there's actually two of these half-plate ambrotypes. When these went for sale about a decade ago, it was a large collection of items that came out of this sale related to Metz, related to his service in the military. You probably saw there's a buff double belt buckle that is shown in the image, sash. All of those items were still in the family and were sold at auction. Unfortunately, I was left with only the image itself, but there's an identical image to it out there. My understanding, that one went to another member of the family, so kind of good to know one of the family members appreciated it enough to kind of go the extra mile to bring it back home. All right, next image here. Another one of my favorites. Did I mention that? Yeah, I told you that. So I'll kind of let this one bring this up a little closer for everybody to see. This is a 6-plate ambrotype. I'm trying to move this so there's not much glare there. Unfortunately, he's unidentified, but it's a unique one. Probably the main reason this one, means a lot to me. It's actually the first hard image that I ever purchased. So to me, this is the beginning of my collection. I'd been a war relic collector for a number of years, but this is my first hard image. And this image, probably when I saw it, number one, I knew it was a North Carolina image. You may have seen when I did the close-up there, this image is taken by the gentleman known as the Raleigh photographer, Esley Hunt. And the reason we know that is because of the chair that he's seated in. It's a very unique chair, has a finial on the two corners of the chair that is seen in his studio and in his images. So that was probably the first thing that caught my eye. I knew, even though it was unidentified, I knew it was a North Carolina soldier. But more than anything else, I mean, this is a young boy, barely a man, who has not seen the horrors of war at this point. And he's wearing sort of the standard 1861 North Carolina sack coat, the 6-button coat that is prescribed by the regulations in 1861. It's got the black shoulder cloth there with it. And to me, when I look at this image, I see all of North Carolina in it. And so it's a kind of a special one to me, even though it's not identified and I don't have that extra story that I can put along with it. So this next image here is also identified, but we know a little bit about it. So I'll tell you about that, give you a little chance to take a look here. As I mentioned, this is unidentified, but it came from Granville County, North Carolina, which is in sort of the central northern part of the state, right along the border with Virginia. And a couple things I will note about the image. it matches up, but number one, we know it's came out of Granville County, but it also matches up and is consistent with other Granville County, North Carolina images. And so as a result of that comparison, we believe he's probably a member of the 12th North Carolina troops. There were 2 companies from Granville County that hailed from the 12th North Carolina. His uniform, which you saw, single-breasted frock coat, and with the black trim, very early war look that you see in North Carolina. You see it in Virginia, you see it in other states, but that's consistent with other identified 12th North Carolina images from Granville County. And likewise, the same pose we see in a number of identified images from this regiment. I would say we don't technically know the photographer. I will say the quality of the image, the clarity, the chair, the table, the book on the table have many of the attributes of C.R. Reese in Richmond. I'm not one to sort of bandy that out there without being able to back it up. I'll let you all decide that. But it's a beautiful image, like I say, with the clarity. One of the things that struck me about this, in addition to it being a North Carolina guy that I could sort of know the history on, the colorist tinted his eyes. If you look at the image very closely, I think I may have posted this a while back on Civil War Faces because I was so amazed by this, but you can actually kind of zoom in or scan in on this image and make out the fact that he colored the eyes blue. And that just, the artistry there, the beauty there of a photographer or colorist being able to do that, it just amazes me, still amazes me to this day. And I've always, I love this image because of it. So hope you all enjoyed it as well. Next image here, figured I'd shift over, show an officer. Try to bring this up so everyone can see it for a minute. This is, at the time, would be Second Lieutenant John Hinsdale. John Hinsdale, for those of you who know a little bit about North Carolina history, probably recognize that name. I will tell you, he must be the most photographed North Carolinian out there. You all, run a Google search and you're going to find there are probably, I think there's 4 or 5, maybe 6 wartime period images or pretty close to it images of Hinsdale from early in the war to late in the war, and maybe even a couple that are in uniform but taken after the war. He's definitely one of those people who likes to be photographed. This obviously is a CDV. Interestingly enough, it is a post-war CDV of an original image. The CDV itself is taken by John Watson, who took over for Esley Hunt in 1865 in Raleigh. It's got that Watson backmark. We find a lot of images right after the war being done like that, images being copied, guys showing up, putting on their old uniform and getting images taken by Watson. But this one is obviously an early war based on his rank. So he starts out as a lieutenant, starts moving up the ranks, serves the majority of the war in a staff officer capacity. And before I forget, Hinsdale's actually a Yankee. He's born in Buffalo, New York, but family moves to North Carolina before the war. And he is a student at the University of North Carolina when the war breaks out. So forgot that little kind of preview story. So he joins up. He has an education perfect for a staff officer and actually serves through much of the war on the staffs of General Theophilus Holmes. He serves with James Johnston Pettigrew. He serves with William Dorsey Pender, and then again goes actually back when Holmes is shipped out to the Trans-Mississippi. Hinsdale goes with him. And later in 1864, when Holmes is relieved of that command out there, Holmes comes back to North Carolina and is put in charge of the North Carolina Reserve troops. And it is at that point that Hinsdale is commissioned a colonel with the 3rd North Carolina Junior Reserves, and that is the commission and the rank that he would finish up with in 1865 at the end of the war. So, unique image. Check him out on the web. Like I said, run that name, John Hinsdale. A lot of great history about him out there, and many, many more images of him. All right, this next image here, I'll give a moment to kind of zoom in on this. This is another just absolutely stunning image with the color and the look of this soldier. He is identified. His name is Joseph Walker Garrard, Garrard. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that exactly correct. This is a 1/9 plate ambrotype. Obviously, it's been well colored. Garrard is just 17 years old when he enlists into service, and he joins a company known as Latta's Company, and their sort of role, not only as their company but also with the battalion that they are later organized with, is to remain in North Carolina and to guard bridges, to guard railroad crossings, and to serve as prison guards, sort of a kind of a local service unit. And I believe it's early war when this image is taken as a result of this. We don't see the full uniform, but you see kind of a tight-fitting, what we presume is some sort of shell-type jacket that we start seeing in 1862 in North Carolina. Yet he retains the black shoulder cloth. So I've always kind of looked at this as sort of the hybrid between the early sack coat and North Carolina moving to what we would otherwise know as a quote-unquote North Carolina depot jacket. Garrard's unit eventually is transferred over to the ANV. In 1863, they get made a part of the 66th North Carolina. They then come 1864, get sent back to North Carolina on detached service in order to hopefully prevent and defend Fort Fisher, which we all know doesn't occur. And when Fort Fisher falls and then Wilmington falls, the 66th North Carolina ends up basically being attached with the Army of Tennessee as things kind of progress into the Carolinas under Joe Johnston. He is actually wounded toward the end of the war, and it's a slight wound. It's not mortal or anything like that, but as a result of that, he doesn't show up on the Bentonville surrender records. There's a lot of theories about why this occurs. The most logical one I can tell you is that the colonel of the 66th North Carolina and some of the others that were in the same brigade are actually told, look, you know, you're technically still a part of the Army of Northern Virginia, and so, you know, you can look at it and say you got paroled on April the 9th when Lee surrenders up at Appomattox. So some stay on with the Army of Tennessee, others basically just walk home. Garrard here is a native of Orange County, North Carolina, Durham area, and needless to say, Bentonville, Bentonville, Bennett Place, where the surrender actually occurred, is literally just down the road from his home. And so I'm inclined to believe after he gets wounded, he just says, you know, I've been paroled on April the 9th. I'm just going home, and that's what he ends up doing. So unique story here, makes it through most of the war, and then gets wounded at the end. I will mention, and you may have noticed this when I showed it, we do not know who the photographer is here. It is very likely to be the Raleigh photographer, Esley Hunt. When we look at this image, you do not see the distinctive chair But that really doesn't mean anything. The chair doesn't have to be in the pose. Could be using a different chair. He had several people working for him, as well as another colorist. I would say based on the quality of the image and the coloring of the image, it is very likely it could have come out of Raleigh. That would also be consistent with his military service. Moving on to the next one. This is Henry Yow, Y-O-W. I will give you a moment to take a look at him. This is a 6-plate tintype, and tell you a little bit about him. Yow is a native of Stanley County. It's in the southern kind of most part of North Carolina, down on the border with South Carolina. And Yow enlists in Salisbury, North Carolina, which isn't too far from his home. His company eventually is made a part of the 42nd North Carolina. He serves, I tell people, I like this a couple different reasons. You can see clarity there, very nice. It's a nice pose. It is a great example of a North Carolina issued jacket for the time period, 1862, 63. It's just a perfect example of that. And how North Carolina has changed from that sack coat that we saw earlier. His history is neat, though. When I got this image, I also got a number of documents that were in the family. A Bible that had a pre-war date on it that he allegedly carried, but certainly was a very small testament that he owned. And then as I dug into his military service, he's an amazing one, and I can't remember if it's 2 or 3 times as we look at his muster rolls in 62, 63, 64, and then into 65. On the company muster rolls, he's listed as deserted. And each time on maybe the next muster roll or a muster roll a few months down the road, they list him as having rejoined the service. And throughout this sort of, deserts and then rejoins and then leaves again, deserts, not absent without leave. It actually says deserts. Every time he joins back. And I thought that was interesting, especially when, at least so far, I've never seen any type of court-martial records or anything other than them allowing him to rejoin. And so he continues to do this until the end of the war. The 42nd, like the other unit I mentioned before, they're attached with the Army of Tennessee at the end of the war, and Yow is actually wounded and captured at the Battle of Wise's Fork, which occurs outside of Kinston in, I believe, April of 1865. I'm trying to look at my notes here. He in March of 1865. He is sent up to Point Lookout and eventually released a couple months later at the conclusion of the war. And I'll leave you with this. Interestingly enough, he was married. He had married in 1861, and he and his wife had a number of children. Ironically, the arrival of those children seemed to coincide with his desertion from the Army. So I'll let you figure that one out. Bully for him. All right, next image. Got a few more for you, and certainly willing to answer any questions that anyone may have tonight. Going to give you a zoom in here. This is a 6-plate tintype. Likely, we don't know the photographer, but based on the military service, likely taken in either Richmond or Petersburg. This gentleman, his name is Richard McCon. And I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I've also seen it pronounced McCaughan. It's MC, capital K, A-U-G-H-A-N. But I've talked to some people in Carolina and in maybe some debate on how to pronounce that. But with that said, Macon enlists in April of 1864. He's actually fairly young. You can tell more than likely just based on his size at the time this image is taken, he probably hasn't had to suffer too much from wartime rations, but he joins in April of 64 the 16th Battalion, North Carolina Cavalry, with the company that his brothers serve in. He has several brothers who are already in service. One of them a sergeant, non-commissioned officer. The other one, I believe, maybe a private. And so he joins up with them. It's the middle of the war. And essentially he serves through the end. They're in active service in and around Richmond and Petersburg area through the end of the war. And at the Battle of Five Forks, he is captured during the battle and imprisoned, and spends the next couple months in prison until released in June of 1865. Couple of things that I will note about this that I like. Obviously, beautiful image, a lot of clarity with the image itself. It is a great example of a Richmond Clothing Bureau jacket, what we would call Type 2 jacket. Still has those epaulets, buttoned epaulets on the top. We can't tell whether it's got the belt straps on the side, but we can see the epaulets there. And then the other thing, and you probably couldn't notice it, maybe I can try again to give you all a close-up view of this jacket. It has wooden buttons, and this is something I think there's a lot more of these than we may think. But in 1863 and 64, the Richmond Clothing Bureau contracts with the Gibson Cabinetry firm to provide wooden buttons because there's a shortage of the regular supply buttons. So we see on this image, as well as a number of other images and existing uniforms of late war Confederates, this style of jacket and these wooden buttons, and very frequently, if we were to have seen this in color, this is probably that kind of sort of gray-blue English army cloth. So thought I'd mix it up a little bit. This one got a lady here. Zoom in on this. She's actually unidentified, but we know that it's a North Carolina image for at least one big reason. I'll let you take a look at that. Take a look at that backdrop, and what you'll see, you got a lake out there, or a pond, whatever you want to call it. You see some sailboats. You got those trees. This enlargement here really doesn't do it justice. There's a lot of color in this image. She's unidentified, as I mentioned, but this backdrop is not unidentified, and we don't know the photographer himself, but we do basically know the location and the time period. All of the identified images with this backdrop show up with images from the 20th North Carolina, and specifically with the 20th North Carolina in late 1861, early 1862, while they're stationed along the coast of North Carolina, down around Fort Johnson, at that time Smithville, North Carolina, there at the Cape Fear, the entrance to the Cape Fear River, now Southport, North Carolina. So all of those identified images. In fact, those of you who've got state troops and volunteers that I talked about earlier, the cover image of the two soldiers holding their muskets, look closely, it's that backdrop with the sailboats. And we don't know, is she somebody's mother? Is she, the wife of a soldier or wife of an officer visiting? I wish I knew more. Is she just some local civilian down in this area? We probably won't know the answer to that. But I've just always thought it was a beautiful image. It's a ruby ambro, just great color, great content, and clarity with that image. And I just wanted to share that with you. You can also see, I don't know if you could see it when I showed you the enlargement, she's wearing glasses. She's got type of spectacles on. So that type of quality close up. Couple more images with you, and I'll try to look at some of the comments coming in and answer any questions that that you all may have. This image, I'll zoom in here. Some of you may recognize this image. I think I've talked about it on Civil War Faces. It's also been published. It was in a article that I wrote last year for Military Images magazine on the Bermuda photographer S.W. Galt and his photography during the war, specifically of Confederate sailors. This gentleman's name is Thomas Mann Thompson. He actually also hails from the area that I was just telling you about, along the coast of North Carolina. You'll see he's not in a uniform. He's not even in anything that looks military at all, and there's a very good reason for this. He is a pilot for blockade runners, meaning, he gets them in and out of tight spots, rivers, sandbars, you name it. A great story, a fascinating story about him. He, at least so far, is recognized as having made more runs on more ships as a blockade pilot than any other pilot in, I'll call it Confederate service, in Southern service with the blockade runners. I won't go into all of those details tonight and the ships that he served on and the things that he did. As I mentioned, his image is shown in that article last year. I believe it's the fall or the autumn 2019 issue of Military Images. We also did a feature on him in Civil War Navy, the magazine, last year that sort of tells his story and the people that he served with. But it's a great image. This image, as I mentioned, taken in Bermuda, and we basically know it was taken in the summer of 1864, so probably sort of between jobs. He had probably stopped off in Bermuda after one of the ships that he had helped pilot had ended its service or maybe dropped off its goods, and he was waiting for the next run back to Wilmington or back to Charleston, and had his CDV made. This one is in my collection like the others. There's another copy of this CDV. Maybe there's more out there, but at least one more copy that I'm familiar with at the former Museum of the Confederacy, the American Civil War Museum today. All right. Kind of wrapping up here, I'll end with this one. This is another one I know I've shown a few folks and talked about a little on Civil War Faces, and I'll zoom in on a couple things and then sort of tell you the story. So you're kind of looking at this and saying, okay, this is not a hard image. What is this? Those of you probably who are familiar easily know this is at least a copy of what we would call a solar enlargement. A post-war copy of a period image. And I'll tell you about this and why it's significant to me and significant to the North Carolina story. This is actually a relative of mine. This is John Ford Jenkins from the 14th North Carolina. And Jenkins is my great-grandfather's first cousin. My great-great-grandfather was too young to serve. He's 11, 12 years old when the war breaks out, but he does have siblings who served, and then many uncles, first cousins, you name it, who serve. And so for many years, this is the image. This solar enlargement was very familiar to me, very familiar to my family, because it was the only image that we had of our kinsman here. And it's a unique one. He's holding his rifle, very stoic look about him. And it's an image that we had shared. We had shared with people doing research on the 14th North Carolina. We had shared with people like Greg Mast, who were researching images themselves. So sort of to make a long story short, or maybe longer as the case may be, about a decade ago, an unidentified North Carolina ambrotype, or an unidentified ambrotype, shows up in North Carolina. And it's a 6 plate, and The person who finds it is a picker / collector, knows they have a neat image but doesn't know much about it. And after it goes through sort of a couple hands of people saying, oh, well, it looks like this or it looks like that, somebody says, let's send it over to Greg Mast. And Greg gets the copy of the image and immediately identifies it and says, hey, I've got another copy of this image. I've got the post-war solar enlargement of this image, and it is in fact the original image of John Jenkins. And I'll bring this up for you all to take a look at. So it takes a little time at that point. I find out about it eventually, sort of through word or mouth. The person who has it was a collector at the time, wasn't interested in parting with it. But after a couple years, and as I like to look at it as sort of divine providence stepping in, we were in fact able to bring this original image back into the family. He is a member of the 14th North Carolina Troops. He enlists in 1861, serves as a private, just a regular enlisted guy, is present up to the Battle of Malvern Hill, where the 14th North Carolina and their brigade, the brigade with Anderson, George B. Anderson, just suffers tremendous losses during the 7 Days campaign and into Malvern Hill. He actually has his thumb shot off at the battle and transported to the hospital, but returns to service. Unfortunately, he suffers, and we don't know if he was already suffering from it or if he gained it during the service, but he suffers from tuberculosis, and he goes into a hospital in the spring of 1863, ultimately ends up in Lynchburg, Virginia, at the hospitals there in Lynchburg, and he passes away from the tuberculosis there basically mid-summer. And so he dies there. He is actually buried in Lynchburg at the Confederate cemetery, but has a number of descendants still around today. He had a young child with his wife before the war, and so a large family. And as I mentioned, obviously we are all, while I'm a kind of a collateral relative, we are all very happy to kind of have this original back within the family where it should be. And so that's it for me tonight as far as the images go. I'm going to try to scroll through some of this. If I see, I'm doing this on the phone, so it's a little difficult to answer questions. But I'm going to go back through it once we end, and certainly answer any questions that you all may have. I encourage you, I hope you will consider sharing your images, particularly your North Carolina images, with me, for possible future publication if we're able to put something together. Likewise, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you want to see, for those of you who are interested. If you're interested in, and in what type of format you may be interested in with it. Everybody be safe. Really appreciate everything that you all are doing out there, preserving our history, preserving these wonderful images and the stories that go along with them. And I hope you all have a great evening. Good night.